Get out, Malcolm.
At my father's house?
This is not your father's house. This is where powerful people mourn. You restore old staircases.
Name?
Tasha Reed, guest of Mr. Vale.
The guard looked down at my old brass key in my palm. His face changed. Behind him, the mansion's attorney froze when he saw the blue wax seal tied to it.
Sir, where did you get that key?
The gate clicked, and for the first time that morning, nobody was looking at her. I want to tell you about the life I had before that gate, because you need to understand what it cost me to stand there quietly while my own wife told a stranger my name didn't matter. My name is Malcolm Reed. I'm a historic restoration contractor. I fix staircases, cracked plaster, 100-year-old doors that don't hang right anymore. I've spent 20 years learning how old buildings breathe, where the rot hides, where the good wood is buried under bad paint, how to save something everyone else has already given up on. My hands show it. Calluses along the base of my fingers, a scar across my left knuckle from a table saw in my 20s. I used to think Tasha loved those hands. She used to hold them in restaurants, turn them over, and say she liked that I built things with them. That was 7 years ago. Back when we were young and broke and it didn't matter yet. Somewhere in the last 2 years, something in her changed. Not all at once. Slowly, the way water gets into wood before you ever see the rot on the surface. It started small. She stopped introducing me by my job. At first it was, "This is my husband Malcolm." Then it became, "This is Malcolm." No job, no context. Like my work was something she'd rather people not ask about. Then, at a charity dinner for one of her clients, I heard her tell a woman I was in property, which technically wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Tasha is a PR consultant. She builds brand images for museums, charities, and nonprofit galas. The kind of work where every conversation is a performance and every handshake is a transaction. She's good at it. She's sharp, she's polished, she reads a room before she's finished walking into it. I used to admire that about her. I still do, in a way. It's just that somewhere along the way, she started reading me the same way she read her clients, as an asset to manage or a liability to hide. She never said she was ashamed of me directly. She didn't have to. I heard it in the way she introduced me last, in the way she flinched when I mentioned a job site at dinner, in the way she once called my work blue-collar nostalgia to a woman in a $2,000 dress. I let it happen. That's on me. I told myself it was stress, that her job was demanding, that people who spend their lives around money start talking that way without meaning it. I kept working. I kept being reliable. I told myself reliable was enough. Then Graham Vale walked into a donor strategy dinner in a gray suit that cost more than my truck, and reliable stopped being enough. I met Graham the same night Tasha did, a fundraising dinner for a foundation she was consulting for. He came in like he already owned the room, shaking hands, remembering names, laughing at the right moments. He was a luxury developer, somebody said. Resorts, private clubs, high-end residential. The kind of man whose business card made people sit up straighter. He found Tasha before dessert. I watched him lean in and say something that made her laugh. Not her polite laugh, the real one. The one I used to be the only person who got. Then he turned to me and asked what I did. I restore old buildings, I said. Staircases, mostly, doors, old libraries, courthouses, that kind of work. Graham smiled the way men like him smile when they've already decided you're not worth remembering. So you fix what rich men abandon, he said. Tasha laughed, small, quiet, but I heard it. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself it was nothing, a joke, a little jab, the kind of thing men say to each other at dinners like that. But over the next few weeks, Graham kept appearing. A coffee here, a phone call there, always framed as professional. He was interested in arts patronage, he said, and Tasha's charity work put her in the right rooms. She started coming home later. Nothing dramatic, no lipstick on a collar, no perfume that wasn't hers, just a growing distance. A way she looked at me like she was doing math and I kept coming up short. Then, 3 weeks before the day at the gate, she got an invitation. Harrogate Manor, she said, reading it off her phone at the kitchen counter. A memorial. Some old money family. Elijah Whitmore died. Graham says half the donors I need will be there. I felt something drop in my chest when she said the name. Elijah Whitmore. My father. I didn't tell her that. I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds. It sounds like I lied to my wife for years. In a way, I did. But it wasn't the kind of lie you tell to protect yourself. It was the kind you carry because somebody else asked you to, a long time ago, before you understood what you were agreeing to. I was raised by my mother in a small house outside Savannah. She worked as a hospital administrator, steady and proud, and she raised me on her own with help I didn't fully understand until I was older. Elijah Whitmore wasn't a stranger to me. He was there, quietly, carefully, always at a distance from anything public. He'd show up at restoration sites where I apprenticed as a teenager, dressed like an ordinary man, and teach me things nobody else bothered to teach a kid like me. How to read the grain of old wood. How to tell if a foundation was failing before the walls showed it. How to read a deed, a covenant, a property line, and understand what it actually meant instead of what it said on paper. He never explained why he was in my life, not fully. Once, when I was 12, he handed me an old brass key with a small blue wax seal pressed onto a leather cord. This isn't a key to open a door, he told me. It's a key that proves you understand what the door's protecting. Keep it. Don't show it around. One day, people will fight over a house. Don't fight for the house. Fight for what the house was built to protect. I didn't understand him then. I kept the key anyway because it felt important, the way a child keeps something without knowing why. There was a threat once when I was young, something involving the Whitmore family that I never got full details on, some danger connected to being publicly known as his son. My mother and Elijah agreed I'd carry her name, not his. I grew up as Malcolm Reed, not Whitmore. My existence wasn't hidden out of shame. It was hidden to keep me safe, and later out of habit, and later still, because neither of us knew how to undo something we'd built for so long. He called me every few weeks, always careful, always brief. Sometimes we'd meet at a diner off the highway, two men in ordinary clothes having what looked like an unremarkable lunch. Nobody watching would have guessed he was one of the wealthiest men in the state, and I was his only son. 3 weeks before the memorial, he called me for the last time. His voice was weaker than usual. "Malcolm," he said, There's an old lie sitting in the South Archive at Harrogate. When the time comes, you'll need to find it before anyone else does." "What lie?" I asked. "You'll know it when you see it," he said. "Take care of the foundation, not the house. The foundation." The call ended before I could ask him anything else. The next day, my mother called me crying. Elijah Whitmore was dead. I never told Tasha any of it, not because I wanted to keep a secret from my wife, but because Elijah had asked me years ago to hold this quietly until it needed to come out, and because some part of me, if I'm honest, wanted to know if she'd loved the version of me that existed without any of it. The version who just restored staircases and drove an old truck and came home smelling like sawdust. I got my answer on the morning of the memorial when she looked at the navy suit hanging in our closet, the same suit Elijah had once told me was his color for me, without explaining why, and said, "Do you even own a suit that won't embarrass me?" I put it on anyway. I put the brass key in my pocket, the way I had every day for almost 30 years. And I got in the car with my wife, not knowing that in less than an hour she'd be pointing at that same navy suit like it was proof I didn't belong in my own father's driveway. The drive to Harrogate Manor took 45 minutes. Tasha spent most of it on her phone, texting Graham about who would be there, rehearsing names under her breath like a woman preparing for an audition. I watched the Georgia countryside slide by. Old oaks, long fences, the kind of land that's been in families for generations. The kind of land people fight over long after the people who built it are gone. When the estate came into view, even I had to sit with it a second. Iron gates wrapped in decades of ivy. A gravel driveway that curved for what looked like a quarter-mile before it reached the main house. Harrogate Manor rose up at the end of it. Pale stone, tall windows, the kind of southern architecture built to intimidate as much as impress. I'd seen pictures of it once, years ago, from Elijah himself, spread across a diner table like a man showing off snapshots of a life he couldn't otherwise share. Seeing it in person was different. It felt like walking into a memory that wasn't mine, except somehow it was. Graham's car pulled up ahead of ours at the gate. He got out smooth as anything, straightened his jacket, and turned back to smile at Tasha through her window, like he already belonged there. That's when it happened. Tasha turned to me, her hand already on the door handle, her face arranged into something between embarrassment and command. "Get out, Malcolm." I looked at her hand on the handle, then at her face, trying to find the woman I married somewhere in it. At my father's house? I don't know why I said it that way. Maybe some part of me wanted her to hear it, wanted to see if the words would land differently coming from me instead of staying locked in my chest where they'd been for 30 years. They didn't land the way I hoped. She heard father's house and processed it as a joke, or worse, as delusion, like a man trying to inflate himself in front of people who mattered. Her pastel pink blazer didn't move an inch. Her black hair was pulled into that perfect bun she wore when she'd already decided something and wanted the world to know it. "This is not your father's house," she said. "This is where powerful people mourn. You restore old staircases. You don't belong in the front seat." Graham leaned forward from the back seat, smiling like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Let the man walk. It'll give him time to think about ambition. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't argue. I've learned over the years that some moments aren't won by arguing. Some moments, you just have to survive with your dignity intact and figure out the rest later. I got out of the car. The driver, a young guy in a black suit who clearly worked for the estate, not for Graham, looked at me for a second too long. He glanced at my navy suit, a little worn at the cuffs but clean and pressed, and then at the iron gate ahead, like he was trying to figure out where exactly I fit into this picture.
A guard stepped up to the driver's side window. "Name?"
Tasha leaned across the seat, voice smooth and practiced. "Tasha Reed, guest of Mr. Vale." The guard nodded, made a note, glanced past her toward me standing on the gravel. I didn't say anything. I reached into my pocket instead, out of habit more than anything. A nervous gesture I've had since I was 12 years old, touching the old brass key on its leather cord like it was a worry stone. The guard's eyes dropped to my hand, to the key resting in my palm, the small blue wax seal catching the morning light. His whole face changed. Behind him, a woman in a charcoal suit, sharp, precise, clearly someone of importance, had been walking toward the gate with a clipboard. She stopped mid-stride when she saw what was in my hand. I'd learn later her name was Evelyn Cross, the Whitmore family attorney for almost 30 years. In that moment, all I knew was that she froze like she'd seen a ghost. "Sir," she whispered, stepping closer, staring at the seal like she needed to confirm what her eyes were telling her. "Where did you get that key?" Tasha laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Why are you asking him anything?" Nobody answered her. The gate clicked open, and for the first time that morning, nobody was looking at her. I want you to understand what that moment felt like from where I was standing, because it wasn't triumph, it wasn't relief. It was more like watching a fault line crack open beneath a floor everyone had assumed was solid. Evelyn Cross didn't smile at me. She didn't welcome me. She looked at me with the sharp, careful attention of a woman recalculating everything she thought she knew about the day ahead of her. "Come with me," she said, not a request. Tasha's window was still down. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" "No problem, Mrs. Reed," Evelyn said without looking at her. "Please proceed to guest check-in. Mr.
Reed will be seated separately."
Seated? Tasha's voice climbed half an octave. "He's not even on the guest list. I told him to wait outside." Evelyn finally looked at her, and there was something in her expression I'd come to recognize over the following days. A controlled, professional patience that made it clear she'd dealt with far more difficult people than my wife. "He doesn't need to be on your list," Evelyn said. "He's on mine." I saw something shift behind Tasha's eyes. Confusion first, then irritation. She wasn't used to not understanding a room. Reading rooms was her entire profession. Graham stepped out of the car, adjusting his cufflinks, trying to reassert some control over a situation that had clearly slipped past him. "Is there an issue with security? I can call ahead. I know the estate manager personally." "There's no issue," Evelyn said. "Mr. Vale, your invitation is confirmed. Mrs. Reed, yours as well, as his guest. Mr.
Reed's status is being handled directly.
Handled by who?"
Tasha asked.
Evelyn didn't answer. She turned and started walking up the long gravel drive, and I followed, because at that point, I didn't have a better option. And honestly, some small, tired part of me wanted to see how far this would go before the truth caught up with all of us. Behind me, I heard Tasha telling the driver to go ahead, her voice tight with the particular anger of someone who's just realized they don't have the full picture. As we walked, an older black man in a formal steward's uniform came out through the front doors to greet the arriving cars. He was maybe 70, silver at the temples, moving with the unhurried dignity of someone who'd worked in this house longer than most of the guests had been alive. His eyes found me before Evelyn even said a word. "Mr. Reed," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly with an emotion I couldn't name yet.
It's good to see you again, sir. I hadn't seen this man since I was a boy, maybe 10 years old, at one of the rare times Elijah had let me visit the property under a cover story about a family friend's estate. But I remembered him, Vernon Pike. He used to sneak me lemonade in the kitchen and tell me stories about the old carriage house. "Vernon," I said quietly, "it's been a long time." "Your father said the house would know you before the world did," he said. I suppose he was right. Behind me, I heard Tasha's heels crunching on the gravel, closing the distance, her voice sharp. "Malcolm, what is going on? Why does the staff know your name?" I turned to look at her. For the first time that morning, I didn't feel embarrassed, or small, or like a man who'd been correctly put in his place. I felt like a man standing at the edge of something enormous, something that had been waiting my whole life to be understood. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. I knew pieces. I didn't know the whole shape of what was coming. Evelyn turned back to all of us. "The reading will begin in 1 hour. Mrs. Reed, Mr. Vale, you'll be shown to the library with the other guests. Mr. Reed, you'll come with me." Tasha grabbed for the key in my hand, quick and sudden, like she could snatch away whatever power it seemed to be giving me. "What is this? Some old thing you carry around to feel important?" Evelyn's voice cut through the air, cold and final. "Don't touch that, Mrs. Reed." Tasha froze, her fingers inches from my palm. It was the first crack I saw in her certainty, a small one, but I saw it. Evelyn led me through the main hall, marble floors, portraits along the walls, a hush in the air that felt less like grief and more like anticipation. She didn't explain anything as we walked. She asked me one question. "How long have you had that key?" "Since I was 12, I said. She nodded slowly, like that confirmed something she already suspected, and didn't ask anything else. She brought me to a small study off the main library, told me to wait, and closed the door behind her. I sat there for nearly 40 minutes, alone with a portrait of a man I recognized instantly. Elijah Whitmore, in his 50s, painted in the formal, stiff style rich families use to project permanence. His eyes in the painting looked tired, in the same way I remembered them looking tired near the end of our phone calls. I thought about the day he gave me the key. I thought about the diner lunches, the deed reading lessons, the way he'd trace his finger along old property lines and tell me, "Paper lies if you don't know how to read it, but wood and stone never do." I thought about the old lie in the South Archive and what it might mean, and whether I'd have the strength to find it before whatever was coming crashed down on all of us. Eventually, Evelyn returned. "It's time," she said. The library at Harrogate Manor was larger than most people's houses. 2 stories of bookshelves, a wall of tall windows overlooking the garden, rows of chairs set for maybe 60 people, trustees, donors, a few distant cousins I didn't recognize, museum board members, foundation executives, Graham's personal attorney, a thin man with a leather folder who kept glancing at his watch. Tasha sat near the front, beside Graham, her back straight, her face composed into the practiced calm she wore at every important event. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression flickered. Surprise, then confusion, then something harder to name when Evelyn directed me to a seat in the center of the room, facing Elijah's portrait directly. A wooden box sat on a table at the front, sealed with the same blue wax I wore around my neck. Evelyn stood beside it, opened a leather folder, and began. "We are gathered to execute the last will and testament of Elijah Whitmore," she said, "in accordance with his wishes, and under the observation of the Whitmore Family Trust." The room settled into that particular silence people reserve for money and death. She read through smaller bequests first: donations to museums, gifts to longtime staff, contributions to charities Elijah had supported for decades. I watched the room relax slightly with each name, the tension easing as people assumed the big estate would simply be divided among the obvious parties. I saw a few cousins nod at each other, already doing math on inheritance shares. Then Evelyn paused and opened a sealed section of the document. "To the one person who understood Harrogate before he ever inherited it," she read, "I leave the whole of my estate." The room went still. Tasha turned to look at me for the first time with something other than certainty in her eyes. Evelyn continued, "Malcolm Reed is named sole beneficiary of Harrogate Manor, its surrounding land, and all associated structures. Malcolm Reed is granted controlling voting authority over the Whitmore Preservation Trust. Malcolm Reed holds final decision-making power over any proposed development of Whitmore land assets." Tasha stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "There must be another Malcolm Reed." Evelyn didn't look up from the document. "There is only one named in this document." I sat there, feeling the weight of 60 pairs of eyes shift onto me, and I understood in that moment that everything my wife had wanted, the mansion, the social standing, the access to people who mattered, the gala invitations, the donor authority, the seat at every important table, had just been handed to the man she'd told to get out of the car an hour earlier. But that wasn't even the part that would break the room open. Evelyn hadn't read the final clause yet, and neither Tasha nor Graham had any idea what was still sealed inside that box. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the room dissolved into overlapping voices, trustees murmuring to each other, a cousin asking loudly who Malcolm Reed even was, Graham's attorney flipping through his folder like the answer might be hiding in there. Tasha turned to me, her voice low and shaking. "You knew about this?" "I didn't know what was in the will," I said, which was true. I knew whose son I was. "Whose son?" she repeated, like the words didn't fit together right in her mouth. Evelyn raised a hand for quiet, and the room, out of decades of habit around money and lawyers, obeyed her. "The estate transfer is contested only if formally challenged within this proceeding," Evelyn said. "Are there objections?" Graham stood up before Tasha could speak, buttoning his jacket with the smooth confidence of a man who'd navigated 100 boardrooms. "With respect, Ms. Cross, this needs review. Mr. Reed is, by his own admission, a general contractor with no experience managing an estate of this size, let alone an $800 million land portfolio. I'd ask the trustees to consider a formal delay pending competency review." A trustee near the back, an older man with silver hair and a skeptical expression, nodded slowly. Mr. Vale raises a fair point. We don't even have a public profile on this man, beyond a business license for a small restoration company. I felt the old familiar heat rise in my chest, the same heat I'd felt 100 times over the years when someone decided my hands meant my mind didn't matter. But I'd learned something from Elijah across all those diner lunches. The men who yell first are usually the men with the weakest position. I stayed quiet. I let them talk. Evelyn didn't. "The competency of the named beneficiary is not open to trustee review," she said. "Mr. Whitmore's will was drafted and certified with full legal capacity." "If you wish to challenge that certification, Mr. Vale, I'd remind you that you are not a trustee, a family member, or a legal party to this estate. You're a guest." Graham's jaw tightened just slightly, the first crack in his own composure. "I have significant financial interest in the future of this land." "Noted," Evelyn said, "and irrelevant to this proceeding." I watched something pass across Graham's face in that moment. Not anger, exactly, but recalculation, the look of a man adjusting a plan that had just hit an unexpected obstacle. Tasha sat back down slowly, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Everything I wanted," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You have everything I wanted." I didn't answer her, because there wasn't an answer that would have made either of us feel better in that moment. She wasn't wrong. The mansion, the social standing, the access to power, the seat at the table with people who could open doors just by saying your name. She'd wanted all of it, enough to tell me to get out of a moving car in front of strangers. Now it was mine, and she was sitting in a chair meant for a guest. Evelyn closed the folder. "The estate transfer stands as read. There is, however, one additional sealed clause, to be opened only in the event the transfer is formally contested." Graham's attorney looked up sharply. "Contested how?" "By written objection from a legal party," Evelyn said, "which we do not yet have." She looked directly at Graham when she said it, and I understood even then that she already suspected what he was going to try next. She was right. Within 24 hours, Graham would file exactly that objection, and the sealed clause would open a door none of us were ready for. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of quiet, careful conversations. Evelyn walked me through the basic shape of what I now controlled: the manor itself, the surrounding acreage, staff housing on the eastern edge of the property, an old family chapel, and a controlling seat on the Whitmore Preservation Trust, which held authority over any development on Whitmore land. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a man who'd been handed the keys to a car with no idea what was under the hood. Tasha didn't speak to me again that day. She left with Graham in his car, and I stood on the gravel where, hours earlier, she'd told me to get out. And I watched them go, understanding that whatever we'd been to each other, it was already over. The marriage had been quietly dying for a while. That morning had just made it visible to both of us at the same time. I stayed at Harrogate that night, in a guest room Vernon showed me to without a word of explanation needed between us. Before he left, he paused at the door. "Your father used to sit in the library some nights, just looking at your picture," he said. "Small one, from when you were a boy. Kept it in his desk. I always wondered when he'd finally let the world see you." "I wish he'd told me more," I said. "About all of it." Vernon nodded slowly. "Man like that,
He protects people the only way he knows how. Sometimes that means keeping them in the dark a little longer than they'd like. That night I called my mother. She cried when I told her what the will said. Not from surprise, she'd clearly always known this day might come, but from something closer to grief, like a door in her own life had finally closed after 30 years of being held slightly open. He loved you the only way he was allowed to, she told me, quietly, from a distance. It wasn't enough, but it was real. I believed her. I still do. The next morning, Evelyn found me in the garden near an old chapel at the edge of the property. She held a single sheet of paper. "Graham Vale filed a formal objection to the estate transfer this morning," she said, "on the grounds that you allegedly concealed material facts about your identity from the trustees and that your competency to manage assets of this scale is unproven." "Can he do that?" I asked. "He can try," Evelyn said, "which means the sealed clause opens now, whether we're ready or not." She paused. "There's something else you should see first, though. A letter. Your father left it for you specifically, separate from the will, to be given to you only if you considered walking away." I hadn't told anyone I was considering that, but somehow Elijah had known I would. She handed me a plain envelope sealed with the same blue wax. I opened it there in the garden, under an old oak that must have been 100 years old, and read the last words my father ever wrote to me. "Malcolm," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you're standing somewhere you never expected to stand, wondering if it's worth the weight it's about to put on you. I need to tell you something I should have told you decades ago. I didn't hide you because I was ashamed. I hid you because the world I built attracts people who see land and power before they see a man. I couldn't protect you from that world and give you to it at the same time. So I chose to protect you, and it cost us both something we can't get back. I know you'll be angry when the truth comes out. Angry that I waited. Angry at people who will suddenly claim to have always respected you when a week earlier they wouldn't have looked at you twice. That anger is fair, but don't spend it the way some men would. Don't use the truth like a weapon just because you finally have one in your hand. A weapon can win you a room. It can lose you a legacy. I built Harrogate to protect something bigger than a house. The people on that land, the history buried in that ground, the families who've worked it for generations, the ones buried in the old cemetery on the southern edge who never got a headstone with their real names on it. There are people who will look at this estate and only see $800 million of potential. Don't let them win, even if winning against them feels satisfying. There's an old lie sitting in the South Archive under the carriage house. It involves a man you're about to meet, if you haven't already, and his father before him. Find it before he does. It's the only thing that will stop what he's trying to do to this land. You are my only son, Malcolm. I should have said that to your face more times than I did. I'm saying it now, in ink, because it's the only way I have left. Take care of the foundation, not the house. The foundation. Your father, Elijah. I sat under that oak tree for a long time after I finished reading. I won't pretend I didn't cry. 30 years of a careful, hidden relationship, and it ended with a letter in a garden on a property I now legally owned and didn't yet understand. Evelyn waited a respectful distance away until I folded the letter and stood. "The old lie," I said. "You know what it is." "I have suspicions," she said.
Your father kept the details from me deliberately. He said you'd need to find it yourself with the key. I looked down at the brass key still hanging around my neck. Then I guess it's time I used it. There's something you should know first, Evelyn said. Graham Vale's development proposal for this land is worth roughly $800 million. Luxury villas, a private equestrian club, an exclusive wellness retreat. He's been quietly acquiring support from certain trustees for over a year, positioning himself before your father even passed. And Tasha, I said, was she ever really interested in donor relations? Or was she always a way in? Evelyn's expression softened slightly, the first real human moment I'd seen from her. I can't answer that. I don't think even she fully knows the answer to that. I thought about the invitation on our kitchen counter 3 weeks ago, about the excitement in Tasha's voice, about Graham's convenient appearances in her professional life. I didn't have proof of anything calculated on her part, just a growing suspicion that I wasn't the only one who'd walked into this weekend with secrets. I need to see the South Archive, I said. The carriage house sat at the edge of the property, half swallowed by ivy, its old wooden doors bearing scorch marks from a fire that had happened decades before I was born. Elijah had mentioned it once, briefly, calling it the place where an old lie almost burned down with the building, but didn't. The brass key didn't open the main carriage house doors. It opened a smaller, reinforced door built into the stone foundation beneath it, an archive room, clearly added after the fire, designed to survive whatever had almost destroyed the original structure. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old paper. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding boxes of documents, ledgers, and photographs going back generations. It took me almost 2 hours of careful searching before I found the specific box marked with the Whitmore family crest, an oak tree and a lantern, the same symbol pressed into the wax seal on my key. Inside, I found the original land deed for Harrogate Manor, decades old, its language dense with the formal phrasing of another era. Attached to it was a preservation covenant I'd never known existed, a legal restriction older than Elijah himself, stating that no portion of Harrogate land could be sold, redeveloped, or repurposed if doing so disturbed the historic cemetery on the southern boundary, the staff housing, the family chapel, or an educational trust established for the local community. If that covenant was still valid, Graham's $800 million development plan wasn't just controversial, it was illegal. I kept searching. Beneath the deed, I found an old insurance investigation report from the carriage house fire, dated decades back, naming a man I didn't recognize at first, until I saw the last name, Vale. Graham's father had been investigated decades earlier for what the report called a suspected fraudulent insurance claim tied to the carriage house fire, an attempt, it seemed, to collect on a property loss while quietly trying to force a sale of adjacent land at a reduced price. The investigation had been quietly closed without charges, likely through money or influence, but the report sat there in that archive as proof that this wasn't Graham's first attempt at Harrogate. It was his family's second. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, I found an old photograph. Elijah, maybe 15 years younger than I remembered him, standing with his hand on the shoulder of a boy who could only have been me, maybe 7 years old, both of us standing in front of the very oak tree where I'd read his letter that morning. I stood there in that archive for a long time, holding a photograph that proved a relationship I'd spent my whole life keeping secret. sitting beside evidence that could dismantle a nearly billion-dollar plan built on a foundation of old lies and older fraud. I knew, holding all of it, that I had exactly what I needed to win. I also knew, remembering my father's letter, that winning wasn't the same as doing this right. I carried the box back to the main house, where Evelyn was waiting, and where I'd soon learn that Graham had already scheduled an emergency trustee meeting in the ballroom for the following afternoon. One he clearly believed would end with him controlling Harrowgate's future. He had no idea what was in the box I was carrying. The ballroom at Harrowgate had been built for exactly this kind of gathering. High ceilings, a long table down the center, enough space for every trustee, board member, and interested party to sit and watch two men decide the future of $800 million of land. Tasha sat near Graham again, though I noticed she kept a small, deliberate distance between them now, like she was recalculating her own position in real time. She looked at me when I walked in with the navy folder under my arm, the brass key still around my neck. And something in her expression had changed since the library. Less certainty, more uncertainty about which version of the last 3 weeks had been the true one. Graham stood first, addressing the room like a man who'd rehearsed this exact moment. "I want to be direct," he said. "Mr. Reed inherited this estate through a will none of us had visibility into until yesterday. He concealed his identity from every person in this room, including his own wife. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it matters. A man willing to hide the truth about who he is isn't a man I'd trust with the future of this land, or the communities depending on responsible development." A murmur ran through the trustees. I let it settle before I spoke. "He never even told his own wife who he was," Tasha said, quiet but clear enough for the room to hear. I looked at her. "And you told me who you were the moment you thought I had nothing." The room went still in a different way than before, not shocked by scandal this time, but uncomfortable with something raw, more personal playing out in front of them. Graham recovered quickly, redirecting. "Regardless of personal matters, I'd like the trustees to consider the development proposal I submitted last month. Luxury residential units, a private club, a wellness retreat, designed to preserve the manor's architectural integrity while modernizing the estate's financial future." He gestured to his attorney, who began distributing glossy printed proposals around the table. I opened my own folder instead. "Before anyone reviews Mr. Vale's proposal," I said, "I'd like to ask him a few questions about the land itself." Graham's smile flickered, just slightly. "I'm not sure that's necessary." "Humor me," I said. "You're asking these trustees to approve development on land you've described in your proposal as suitable for construction. Can you tell me the condition of the southern drainage system beneath the old carriage house?" Silence. "Can you tell me the depth restrictions on the cemetery easement along the southern boundary?" I continued. "Or the load-bearing status of the foundation beneath the east wing following the 1962 fire?" Graham's jaw tightened. "That level of engineering detail is handled by my team during due diligence, not before board approval." "That's the problem," I said. "You priced the land, you didn't read it." A trustee near the end of the table, the same silver-haired man who'd questioned my competency the day before, leaned forward, suddenly more interested than skeptical. "Mr. Reed, Are you saying there are structural or legal obstacles to this development that Mr. Vale's team hasn't disclosed? I'm saying there's a preservation covenant attached to the original Harrogate deed, I said, sliding the document across the table, restricting any development that disturbs the cemetery, staff housing, the chapel, or the educational trust established on this land generations ago. I'm also saying the deed submitted with Mr. Vale's proposal is missing a page. Graham's attorney flipped hurriedly through his folder. Evelyn stood and crossed to the table, examining the deed I'd brought against the copy Graham's team had submitted. Her expression sharpened into something close to alarm.
"He's right," she said. "This page is missing from your submission, Mr. Vale. Without it, the covenant restriction doesn't appear in your version at all."
"An oversight," Graham said quickly. "Clerical, nothing more."
"Perhaps," I said, "except the paper on the page I found doesn't match the age of the rest of the document. The ink oxidation is different. The fold marks don't align with how this deed has been stored for decades. Someone altered this." I could hear the room shift again, chairs creaking as people leaned forward, whispers passing down the long table. Graham stood, his composure finally cracking at the edges.
"I don't appreciate the implication that I've falsified legal documents."
"I haven't implied it," I said quietly. "I've shown it." That night, after the ballroom meeting dissolved into confusion, whispered phone calls, and trustees demanding independent document review, Tasha found me in the garden again, near the same oak tree where I'd read my father's letter. She looked different than she had at the gate 3 days earlier, less armored, tired in a way I hadn't seen since the early years of our marriage, before either of us had anything to prove to anyone. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Privately?" I nodded, and we sat on an old stone bench that had probably been there since before either of us was born. "I need you to know," she said, "that whatever's happened between us, we're still married. I can help you navigate this world, the donors, the board, the social politics of it. I'm good at that, Malcolm. You need someone who understands these people." "Is that what you wanted from me?" I asked. "A door?" She flinched, but didn't answer right away. "I wanted a life bigger than the one we had. Is that so terrible?" "It's not terrible to want more," I said. "It's terrible to make someone feel small for not being able to give it to you fast enough." Her eyes filled, and for a moment, I saw something real underneath all the polish. Not manipulation, just fear. The specific fear of a woman who'd built her entire sense of worth around proximity to importance, and was now realizing how little of that was ever really hers. "You let me be wrong about you," she said quietly. "No," I said. "I let you be honest about me." She didn't have an answer for that. We sat in silence for a while. Two people who'd once loved each other honestly, now separated by choices that couldn't be undone with an apology in a garden. Later that night, walking back toward the main house, I overheard something I don't think I was meant to hear. Graham, on the phone near the carriage house, his voice low, but not low enough. "She's served her purpose," he was saying. "Once the vote's settled, we manage her exit quietly. No need to keep her involved past that." I didn't tell Tasha what I heard right away. I wasn't protecting Graham. I was thinking about the letter in my pocket, about not using truth like a weapon just because it was satisfying to swing. But I filed it away because I suspected she'd need to hear it eventually, from someone who wasn't trying to manipulate her feelings the way Graham clearly was. The final sealed clause opened 3 days later, once Graham's formal objection forced Evelyn's hand. We gathered again in the library, smaller this time, just the trustees, Evelyn, Graham, and his attorney, Tasha, and me. Evelyn held the last sealed document, the one meant only to be opened if the transfer was contested. "This clause was prepared by Mr. Whitmore specifically for this circumstance," she said, "in the event of formal contest to the estate transfer." She opened it, read silently for a moment, then looked up at the room. "Malcolm Reed is not only the named beneficiary of this estate," she said. "He is Elijah Whitmore's only legally recognized son." The room went completely silent. Tasha sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at me like she was seeing every version of the last 7 years rearrange itself in real time. Graham's face lost all its color. Evelyn continued reading. Due to a documented threat against the family during Malcolm's childhood, his identity was legally concealed under his mother's surname, with full knowledge and consent of the court to protect his safety. This concealment does not affect the legal validity of his paternity or his inheritance rights, both of which were formally established and notarized when Malcolm reached adulthood. She nodded toward a screen at the front of the room and pressed a button on a small remote. Elijah's face appeared, recorded some months before his death, thinner than I remembered, but his voice steady. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means someone tried to take the house without understanding the home. My son, Malcolm, is the only person who ever understood Harrogate as more than an asset. Not because he was born to it, but because he learned to protect it before he ever knew he'd inherit it. That's why it's his. Not because of blood alone, because he proved over and over in ways none of you saw that he could be trusted with something bigger than himself." The recording ended. The room stayed silent for a long moment after. Tasha finally spoke, her voice small. "Everything I ever wanted," she said, almost to herself. "The house, the status, a powerful husband, even Graham's world. It was all sitting right next to me the whole time, and I threw it out of a moving car." I didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of that moment where gloating would have made either of us feel better. The vote happened within the hour. With the altered deed exposed, the fraud investigation reopened on Graham's family history, and the preservation covenant confirmed as legally binding. The trustees rejected his development proposal unanimously. His investors, informed almost immediately by his own attorney, who clearly wanted no part of what was coming, began quietly withdrawing their support. Within weeks, his permits were frozen pending a fraud investigation into the altered documents. I didn't have to say a cruel word to any of it. The evidence did what evidence does when you let it speak for itself. Tasha and I finalized our divorce over the following months, quietly, without the public scandal Graham had clearly hoped might still happen. She didn't receive access to Harrogate, the foundation, or any Whitmore assets. The law was clear on that, regardless of what either of us felt about it. But I didn't go out of my way to destroy her publicly either. I could have. I had more than enough leverage by then. I chose not to. She asked me once, near the end of everything, sitting across from me in a lawyer's office instead of a garden, "After everything, that's all you're going to say?" "No," I told her. "That's all I'm going to take." I placed the brass key on the table in front of Elijah's portrait a few weeks later, in the library where the will had first been read. Evelyn stood beside me. "It's yours now," she said, "officially.
It always was, I said. I just didn't know what door it was waiting for.